Europe didn't just raise defense budgets, it is rewiring the industrial operating system, contracts, supply chains, and fiscal rules to behave more like a war economy. Not in a Hollywood sense, in the governance sense, what gets ordered for how long, under which standards, and with which guarantees. Headlines fixate on spending targets, but the real shift is production governance. Who builds, who buys, who standardizes, and who guarantees supply. That's where deterrence gets real, or stays theoretical. And here's the tension. NATO is asking for deterrence at scale. Europe's industrial base and procurement rules are still fragmented by national systems. So the system is trying to solve that mismatch, and fast. Curiosity loop for the whole video. If you can't scale output, does 5% of GDP become mostly accounting, or a real capability jump? I'm going to keep this clean. One model, 3 cascades, 3 measurable signals you can track. No hype, no Europe is doomed talk. Just the machinery of incentives and constraints. Start with the demand signal, because everything downstream depends on whether demand is durable. At the 2025 NATO summit in The Hague, allies committed to invest 5% of GDP annually on defense by 2035, structured as at least 3.5% of GDP for core defense requirements. That component is explicitly tied to meeting NATO capability targets, then up to 1.5% of GDP for broader defense and security-related investments like resilience, civil preparedness, innovation, and strengthening the defense industrial base. That split matters because it quietly expands what defense investment means from tanks and troops into infrastructure, networks, and industrial throughput. Then the trajectory. NATO's own July 2026 Defense Investment Update says European allies and Canada increased core defense expenditure by nearly 20% in 2025 compared to 2024. NATO's annual report framing says the same thing in slightly different packaging. The spending curve is steep, and it's being treated as a structural shift, not a one-off supplement. Now the industrialization piece. The European Commission's first European Defense Industrial Strategy, EDIS, sets explicit 2030 targets. At least 40% of defense equipment should be bought collaboratively. At least 50% of procurement budgets should be spent on products made in Europe. And at least 35% of defense goods should be traded within the EU instead of outside it. That's not just spend more. It's spend together, spend European, and trade intra-European. In other words, reshape demand to reshape supply. And this is not abstract. The Commission has tied these plans to concrete production scaling, especially ammunition. In a March 2024 Commission Defense Industry release, the EU describes around €2 billion to strengthen readiness, including ramping ammunition production capacity to 2 million rounds per year by the end of 2020, with the ASA program focusing heavily on powder and explosives as bottlenecks and allocating roughly 3/4 of the program to those constraints. The key signal here is that policymakers are naming the unglamorous chokepoints, chemicals, energetics, inputs, not just the finished products. If you're feeling the acronym overload, here's the system map in one sentence. NATO sets capability targets and long-run demand. Member states fund. As the EU tries to coordinate industry scaling and joint buying so that output actually shows up on time. But here's the part most people are missing. The limiter isn't political will alone. Turning budgets into repeatable output. Ammo, air defense, spares, maintenance capacity, drones, secure comms, all under supply constraints and under time pressure. So here's the single framework for this whole video. I'll name it once and then just use it. The contract to capacity loop, CCL. Europe scales a war economy style posture only when procurement contracts reliably trigger factory expansion. Factory expansion lowers unit costs and shortens delivery times. And that improvement justifies bigger multi-year orders. It's a self-reinforcing loop. If the loop is weak, spending can rise while delivery lags. Then governments revert to national buys, and fragmentation deepens. If the loop is strong, stable multi-year demand lets suppliers invest in bottlenecks, train workers, expand shifts, qualify inputs, and keep output steady. The EU's own EDIS targets are basically scaffolding designed to make CCL more likely to exist in practice. To see why this is a structural shift and not just a budget story, watch what the EU is doing with timelines. The Commission's Readiness Roadmap 2030 pushes member states toward earlier milestones, like organizing at least 40% of procurement as joint procurement by end 2027 and raising the share of defense investment sourced from the European defense industrial base to a political target of at least 55%. In plain terms, they're trying to force the contract part of the loop to change behavior before 2030 arrives. Now we connect the triple dots: military, economic, geopolitical tech, with one anchor line after each, same mechanism, contract structure to capacity, capacity to options. On the military side, NATO's 5% commitment is not more of the same. NATO's own explainer ties the 3.5% core component to meeting NATO capability targets. That's a shift from spend at least X to spend to hit specific readiness and capability requirements, which increases pressure for deliverables, not just appropriations. Here's the cascade if CCL is weak. Stockpile gaps persist. Ammo and spares don't magically appear because a budget line item went up. Readiness becomes uneven across allies because some can contract and deliver faster than others. And deterrence credibility stays more dependent on the United States than European leaders say they want. That's not a moral statement, it's a throughput statement. If the output doesn't scale, the burden re-centralizes by default. That sounds stable. It isn't, because uneven readiness creates political friction inside alliances. The countries that deliver start asking why they're carrying the tempo. The countries that can't deliver start arguing that spending should count even when it doesn't produce equipment on time. And the alliance spends time debating accounting rules when it needs production schedules. Now the economic dimension, because war economy is not only factories, it's fiscal architecture. The IMF's research and commentary have been unusually explicit. Defense spending is a macro shock with trade-offs, and outcomes depend heavily on design. In an April 2026 IMF blog summarizing 2 analytical chapters of the World Economic Outlook, the IMF notes that defense spending booms typically last nearly 3 years and raise defense spending by 2.7 percentage points of GDP, and that output tends to rise almost 1-for-1 with defense spending rather than producing a large multiplier. The same IMF piece argues that composition and procurement structure matter, prioritizing investment in equipment and infrastructure, using less fragmented procurement and more common standards, can expand market size, support economies of scale, strengthen industrial capacity, and limit import leakages. Basically, strengthen the loop rather than just inflate the bill. This is where the risk actually increases. If Europe surges spending while supply chains remain heavily foreign dependent, some of the stimulus leaks abroad. Good for allies and partners, but weaker for Europe's own CCL because domestic capacity doesn't expand as much. And if the surge is debt financed in a period of tighter financing conditions, bond market sensitivity rises, which pressures governments into stop-start procurement. Stop-start ordering breaks the loop. Factories don't expand on vibes. They expand on signed, multi-year contracts. The IMF's fiscal monitor language is blunt about the underlying constrained environment. Across Europe, governments face increasingly difficult trade-offs among defense spending, aging-related spending, and investment, especially in a world of higher debt and higher borrowing cost risk. This is not a prediction of fiscal crisis. It's a statement about how crowded the policy space is getting. Now, the geopolitical and technological dimension. Once procurement is standardized and Europeanized, it changes Europe's option set. It reshapes transatlantic defense trade dynamics, export control alignment, and dual-use pipelines, sensors, secure communications, drones, cyber resilience, and industrial software that sits behind manufacturing. The EU's readiness roadmap logic makes this explicit. It is trying to raise the share source from the European defense industrial base and pull joint procurement forward in time, which effectively makes the industrial base a strategic asset rather than a market outcome. But here's the part most people are missing. This doesn't automatically end in strategic autonomy. Structural incentives point toward a more complicated equilibrium. As Europe standardizes, it may gain bargaining power and resilience, but it may still depend on US enablers in key areas: interoperability, certain high-end components, software ecosystems, unless European capacity and standards actually converge at scale. And that unless is doing a lot of work, so Steelman time. To be fair, war economy can be an exaggeration if you hear it as Dechuai-style total mobilization. That's not what's happening. What's happening is an accelerated industrial adaptation after a long period where many states prioritize smaller inventories, just-in-time logistics, and peacetime procurement tempos. NATO's own reporting on spending increases is large in percentage terms, partly because the base was not designed for high consumption scenarios. To be fair, the EU approach could reduce waste. EDIS is explicitly designed to fix fragmentation, more joint buys, more standardization, more predictable demand signals, and a larger share of procurement and trade inside Europe. If that works, it reduces duplication and raises economies of scale. The strategy is not subtle about this. It sets numeric targets that can be measured. To be fair, defense spending can support innovation if it is designed like investment rather than consumption. The IMF itself points out that less fragmented procurement and more common standards can expand market size and support long-term productivity growth, especially when spending leans into equipment, infrastructure, and industrial capacity rather than pure operating costs. Now, here's what the steel man still can't explain. Targets versus enforceability. EDIS has measurable targets: 40% collaborative procurement, 50% made in Europe, 35% intra-EU trade. But procurement is still nationally political. Budgets are voted nationally, contracts are awarded through national processes. Buy European collides with domestic jobs politics inside Europe and with alliance interoperability politics across the Atlantic. If states don't change purchasing behavior, not speeches, but actual purchasing, CCL weakens even if budgets rise. Second gap, bottlenecks are real and technical. The EU isn't funding powder and explosives because it's trendy. It's doing it because there are physical constraints in energetics inputs and qualified production lines that can't be fixed by press conferences. When policymakers start naming powder and explosives as bottlenecks, they are admitting that willpower is not the binding constraint. Throughput is. Third gap, fiscal constraints can break the loop. Even if the strategic intent is stable, the financing can be volatile. The IMF's analysis of Europe's spending pressures, defense alongside aging costs and a rising interest bill, implies a structural temptation toward procurement volatility: delay, pause, renegotiate, rescope. In systems terms, if financing is volatile, production becomes volatile. And if production is volatile, deterrence becomes a promise that depends on next year's budget politics instead of this year's factory schedules. So how do you track whether Europe is actually building a war economy style loop or just announcing targets? 3 signals. Think of them as gates: CCL strengthening or CCL stalling. First signal, joint procurement share. The indicator is measurable progress toward the EU's own targets for collaborative buying. 40% by 2030 in EDIS, and earlier convergence milestones in the readiness roadmap. The threshold rule is simple: if joint procurement trends upward in a sustained way toward those targets, especially if the end 2027 joint procurement milestone is met, it's evidence that Europe is strengthening the contract side of the loop rather than relying on ad hoc national buys. Second signal, ammunition throughput that persists. The indicator is whether the EU's stated goal, capacity to reach 2 million rounds per year by end 2025, translates into steady delivered volumes for multiple quarters, not a one-off ramp claim. The threshold rule: if production stays high across quarters and the powder/explosives bottleneck investment shows up as sustained output rather than temporary spikes, that's the loop operating, not just being funded. Third signal, demand certainty from NATO's 3.5% and 1.5% structure. The indicator is NATO reporting on how many allies are credibly moving toward the 3.5% core requirement and using the 1.5% category for resilience and industrial-based strengthening. The threshold rule: if the count of countries meeting or exceeding the core guideline rises year over year well before 2035, it signals long-duration demand, which is what factories require to justify multi-year expansion. If adoption stays rhetorical and uneven, expect CCL stress and fragmentation pressure. That sounds stable. It isn't. Because if Europe succeeds at building a war economy-style industrial loop, it could produce deterrence and stability by making readiness more credible and less dependent on emergency surges. But it could also lock Europe into a permanently higher military burden that competes with growth, social spending, and debt sustainability. The IMF's framing of hard choices is a reminder. The macro trade-offs don't disappear, they just get managed well or badly. So here's the calm strategic question to end on. If Europe builds a real contract-to-capacity loop, contracts, capacity, consistency, does that make the continent safer by reducing uncertainty? Or does it create a new baseline, where permanent mobilization becomes a default political economy? This isn't about slogans. Watch the loop. If contracts, capacity, and consistency align, the system changes. If they don't, the numbers can rise while the capability gap stays stubbornly familiar.